Pam Dunwell with Your Nurse Advocates Consulting. We are in our series of Bedside Stories, the journey of a nurse becoming a patient advocate. So we are on episode number 5. Things are going to start to get a little bit more interesting, I think. We are going to wrap up my career in Chicago, and I moved to Wisconsin on the Kenosha area. And so to wrap up my career in Chicago, a lot of people, went through the pandemic, and that was the first time they went through something like that. But actually, that wasn't the first time for me. I will say it wasn't as global in the sense that it didn't impact as many people. But in the early 80s, when I was a new RN, we were confronted with the AIDS health crisis. And so when I say it was a big challenge, we didn't have the hazmat suits. I mean, we didn't have any of that, that we had with COVID, but how it was transmitted, wasn't real clear. They were beginning to look at, blood, body fluids, things like that, certain groups of risk than others. But I mean, I had a nurse when I was working in Chicago. I was working on a VIP unit, and that was a special unit in the hospital. It was a 7-bed unit, and it was all carpeted. It looked like a hotel. And I had been recruited to work there. And so anybody that wanted privacy, or we had a lot of wealthy businessmen there that would come to the unit when they just didn't want to be part of the regular hospital part, they could come to this VIP unit. We had a locked liquor cabinet right on the wall next to our locked narcotic cabinet. I mixed drinks for visitors, and sometimes the doctors would write an order that the patient could have a cocktail at bedtime. So I would mix the patient, a drink as well. And, a lot of times they would come in for things like, they'd come in for their colonoscopy prep, or they'd come in for something simple. Oftentimes, they had the money to pay privately to be able to stay there and not have to do these things at home. They wanted someone to do all this for them. So they would come to our unit. I can't say I really met any really famous people. I think I worked that unit. It was a good, probably, probably it was almost 2 years that I worked that unit. I worked night shift. So my kids were little. So I worked a total of 10 years, 3rd shift, full time, while my kids were growing up, so that I slept very little during the day, and would catch a couple hours. It really wasn't safe, but it was what I chose to do, that I could still, raise my kids and do all those things, earn a living at night. I look back at those things, and I think if someone said that I would have to work a 12-hour night shift right now, there's no way. I think I'd immediately get sick to my stomach and say I can't do it. But it worked at that time. I mean, as a Girl Scout leader, I don't know how I did all that stuff, because as I got older, there's no way I could have done all of that and worked full time at the same time. But anyway, we had AIDS patients that would come on the floor. Sometimes they would bring them there, not because they were a special person or had money or wanted privacy or whatever. They did it, I think, for the patients, so they would have more privacy in trying to work through this illness, and when no one knew about it. And we had I had a nurse that floated to our unit. If we had 5 patients or more on the unit, we would get a second nurse. Otherwise, there was just one nurse at nighttime. And so I remember we were full. We had 7 patients on the floor, and they floated a nurse to my unit. And I only gave her the AIDS patient because it was a young man in his 30s. I mean, he was very easy to take care of. He didn't have a lot of needs. He was independent in his room. And so I thought I was being kind to her by not giving her a real, a patient that required a lot of care and take a lot of time. Well, when I gave her that assignment, she walked off the unit. She says, "I'm not taking care of anybody with AIDS," and she left. And I was they didn't have anybody else to send me, so I spent that night by myself. But that really hit hard for me. How does someone, we choose to become a nurse. How can we pick and choose who we're going to take care of and who we're not? So that wasn't very cool to me. And I just don't understand. I mean, when you sign up, I mean, to be a nurse, a doctor, anybody really in healthcare that it deals with and works with the patients, you can't pick and choose who you're going to care for. That's not right. I mean, that's the choice you make when you choose that career. And so that never ever made sense to me, but that's something that I will never ever forget. So we get through the whole AIDS thing. I worked there for a couple of years, and then I had an opportunity to move to Wisconsin. My parents, all my family was there. I had remarried my second husband, and we had our first daughter, and that's when we moved to Wisconsin. So I was looking for a new job, and I found a job at an emergency room. And I'd been a nurse probably about 10 years, and so I thought, well, I guess this is a good opportunity for me to go in the emergency room. And you know what? The emergency room was my all-time favorite job, and for lots of reasons. I think a part of me didn't feel like I was really a nurse until I could function in the emergency room. If I just felt, and this is no judgment on anyone else. This was just my internal, this was my self-talk, that I was saying that if I couldn't function, in those big emergency type situations, then I didn't feel I wasn't living up to my potential as a nurse. I needed to have at least that experience. So I took the opportunity to work in the emergency room. I'll never forget, my preceptor says, "Oh, it's going to take about a year before you get comfortable, being in the emergency room and being on your own." And I was thinking to myself, I said to her, I says, "Well, if it takes me a year to be an emergency room nurse, then maybe I shouldn't be a nurse." And but I learned very, very quickly. I was a little bit cocky there, and I learned very quickly that it took every bit of a year before when the radio went off from the rescue squad, and my stomach would get all in knots and get upset, and because you don't know what's coming in, or something's coming back, something serious is coming in, you got to get your room ready. And frankly, it took a year before I had the same kinds of experiences over enough so that I could learn and function. Because a lot of people don't realize, this was in a busy hospital in Racine. And it took a while. All the bad stuff doesn't come as frequently as often as you think. And so when you're working, all your shifts, sometimes, something bad may have happened the day before. And so it really did take that whole year to be able to get that experience. Had some funny experiences. I think one of the saddest experiences was my first infant code. It was a mom. They had been walking the baby out. Baby, was in the evening, later in the evening. They thought the baby had fallen asleep. They put the baby to bed. They went to check on the baby several hours later and found the baby non-responsive. And it was actually determined that the baby probably passed away sometime during that walk. And it was a 3-month-old SIDS case. And so that was kind of an older baby for that. But that was, I think, the most difficult, most heart-wrenching night in my 7 or so years in the emergency room. That was a tough night. And the mom, we had elderly men that were security guards, and the mom ran into the bathroom. She was banging her head. I'll never forget this. She was banging her head on the stall door. She was just out of her mind with grief. And I said to the security guard, I says, "Are you going to go in there? I'm afraid she's going to hurt herself. She's tearing the bathroom apart." And he looked at me and he says, "I'm not going in there." I'm like, "Oh, okay, great. What good are you?" And I was in the cardiac room. I was in the big trauma room. I was assigned to that part of the hospital or emergency room that night. So it was she was my patient, and I ran outside. I didn't know what to do. I ran outside. She's running, screaming down the parking lot. I just jumped on her back. I remember digging my heels into the ground and just holding her as tight as I can, to stop her, because I was afraid of what she was going to do. And in the meantime, my colleagues in the emergency room are calling the crisis hotline. And so I got her stopped, and the crisis people came and they took over. And, after all of that commotion was done, I still had to take that baby, and I put that baby on that cart and cover that baby up and wheel that baby into the morgue. And that was a really challenge. There's been some funny things we'll talk about, kind of mix up the sad things with the funny things. But I wanted to start this off because it's going to take a couple of episodes. I'm going to end this episode with this. These next couple of episodes are going to talk about my biggest impact of, all these experiences that I shared, back when we talked about the last one where the cancer patient passed away and I didn't stay. Each experience that I had, growing up as a nurse, impacted me and made me who I am today and made me the advocate that I am today. And so one of the things that happened in the emergency room is at night, the doctors, there was a sleeping room in the emergency room, and they, they could lay down, we would call them when someone new came in. And we had an instance where a patient came in with a very serious heart rhythm. And at that time, we would give the patients a medication called lidocaine in a drip, and it would help them get out of this, what we call VTAC. This, you can't sustain that rhythm. It's a very erratic, fast rhythm, and your heart can't fill with blood. So you can't really sustain life on that very long. But back then, that lidocaine, that was a drug of choice. But the problem with that medication is it didn't last very long. You had to, if they didn't convert, so to speak, and go back to their normal rhythm, we would repeat that. And we had a patient who had come in and had a history of that. And the patient usually popped out of it. But this time, the physician was treating the patient from the bedroom, and didn't come out and see the patient, kept repeating the lidocaine. I kept calling and reaching out to those I was supposed to, and he came out in the morning before the next provider came on, and he said, well, she hasn't converted. We need to get her to intensive care. And so I'm wheeling her up, and the whole rule is they don't leave the emergency room unless they're stable. And I knew she wasn't stable, but he said, get her to the emergency room. Get her to the intensive care unit. So I'm getting her to the intensive care unit, and we're transferring her off of the gurney from the emergency room to the bed in the ICU, and she coded. And so the new doctor was the one that responded to the code, and he looked me right in the eye. He says, why are we transferring her? Why, is she here and she's not stable? And I just made a comment about the fact that she was treated from the bedroom, and that emergency room doctor didn't stick around too long. He went on to better things. But that was the episode that happened to me that I found my voice. I was kind of shy, and I was always an introvert, and that night I found my voice, and I developed the courage to, at that point I realized, not doctors don't all walk on water. There's great doctors and there's not so great doctors. And I found my voice that night to be able to speak out for my patients when something was going wrong. And so next episode, we're going to get into that hot and heavy. So next episode is going to be talking about how I got a doctor fired from the emergency room and the consequences that followed after that and the backlash. But that'll be for episode 6. So we'll see you back then. Take care. Have a great day.